We're standing on an uninhabited island at the very southern tip of the planet. Antarctica's not far, so it's cool here with little vegetation and strong winds blowing from all sides. You can find the usual residents of such places, penguins, sea lions, and seabirds, and not a single person. But here you might encounter the most unexpected creature, one that stands out from the whole picture: a sheep. There aren't just one or two sheep here, but about 4,000 of them. The thing is, they look different from the usual sheep you'd see on farms because they're 3 to 4 times bigger, all because of the very thick coat of wool covering their bodies. This wool makes up half, if not more, of each sheep's total weight, so they even walk with difficulty. Drinking and eating is almost done by touch. They're doomed to die. But they're about to do something incredible. They're going to survive, and then form a new, unique species that's never existed anywhere on Earth. So this is a story about the biggest herd of wild sheep in New Zealand. And of course, humans play their part. But first, coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something under the video. Let's start perhaps with the location where the large-scale wilderness began, Campbell Island. It was discovered in 1810 by an Australian captain during a seal hunt, and since the ship belonged to the Campbell brothers from Sydney, they didn't put much thought into naming it. For a while, the island was used for hunting sea lions. Then whalers set up base there, and only in 1896 was the island included in the system of leasehold pastures, which remains a feature of the mainland part of New Zealand. That is, anyone could rent a piece of state land and own it for a while, graze livestock there, build buildings, roads, and all that. Campbell Island was destined for the same fate. The first to occupy it was Mr. Gordon of Gisborne, who sent 400 sheep to the island along with timber for buildings. But by 1900, the first tenant could no longer financially support the operation, and Captain Tucker bought the island. He decided to seriously get into sheep farming and brought in at least 3 shipments of about 1,000 sheep each to the island. Although the records of these deliveries are fragmented, it seems that most of the sheep were merinos or a merino cross. In the end, there were about 4,000 animals on the island, and it turned out to be a pretty good spot for them with lots of different kinds of feed. For example, the very tasty mega-herbs. This is a collective term for herbaceous plants found on the sub-Antarctic islands of New Zealand. These plants have large leaves to make the most of the limited number of sunlight hours. Overall, the conditions for the sheep were excellent. Over the next few years, the herd grew and reached a peak of 7,000 to 8,000 head around 1913. This photo was taken in 1907, right in the period when the population was actively increasing. But the plants that the sheep could feed on gradually ran out, and the number of animals also started to decrease, along with the finances people were willing to spend. As a result, in 1931, the herd was abandoned. By that time, the number had dropped to 4,000. But that was still way too many. By the way, the workers ended up being somewhat abandoned too. For 2 years, the people who were working with the sheep had no boat to get to civilization. Eventually, the government sent a boat to take them along with the wool they'd sheared over 2 seasons, but the wool's value dropped below the cost of renting the boat, and the men didn't get a penny for their work. As for the ownership of the sheep, it still belonged to the owners, but they never returned. And so thousands of sheep were left to fend for themselves. These sheep were completely unsuitable for surviving in the wild. They were bred specifically to produce wool. This means they need to be sheared periodically, at least once a year. Without shearing, they get so covered in wool that it actually becomes a serious threat to their health. Sheep were domesticated around 10,000 years ago, but originally they came from wild mouflons. Mouflons grow wool in the winter to stay warmer and shed it in the summer like many other animals. But humans made it so that domestic sheep no longer shed. And that's why it's believed that their chances of surviving in the wild are very low. For example, we can take a ram named Barak, who was once found in Australia in 2021. When people reached him, it turned out that the animal was close to death because of the huge amount of wool. Poor Barak couldn't see and was exhausted from years of struggling to get food and water. His overgrown wool was so heavy that the ram couldn't walk properly when they finally sheared him. It's believed that he'd been in that condition for 5 to 7 years, and he only survived by a miracle. But if we don't take their wool into account, sheep aren't capable of defending themselves compared to other livestock species. That is, even if the sheep survives a predator's attack, They could die from the injuries or just from panic. Very, very fragile animals. By the way, what about the predators on Campbell Island? And the other conditions? First of all, its area is 27,600 acres, so there's plenty of space here. There are cliffs on the edges and hills inside. The island is constantly battered by wind from all sides, so much so that plant recovery happens slowly. That's a downside. But because of the strong wind, there are no flies on the island at all, which means insects don't bother the sheep. And as I already mentioned, penguins, sea lions, and birds live there. Of all of them, only the skua gull could be dangerous. This bird's known for attacking sheep, but people have never seen any attacks. This could mean two things. Either the seabirds haven't attacked the sheep, or during the moments of observation, the weak and sick sheep that could have been victims were already eaten. In general, the conditions, well, relatively decent. We've sorted out the location, now let's take a look at the dynamics. The year 1913 marks the peak in sheep numbers. That's right after they were first brought to the island. Plenty of food, proper care. 1931 was the year they noticed a drop in the population. It's linked to a shortage of food. But what happened next surprised everyone and sparked debate. The population dropped to a minimum and then suddenly began to grow. And all this without any human involvement. So what happened between 1931 and 1958? Was it a steady decline, or did a huge number of sheep suddenly die off at some point? Some researchers believe the population faced high mortality at first once it was left without human care. No shearing. Remember what happened to poor Barack? He survived purely by chance, but not everyone's that lucky. In the end, only the toughest managed to survive and reproduce on Campbell Island, or maybe the ones whose wool wasn't too thick. A very fast evolution happened. Animals that couldn't cope without people died off quickly without reproducing. The only ones that survived were those with more suitable traits. They made it and passed on their genes to offspring that were even better adapted to life on the island. Eventually, through the power of natural selection, only the toughest sheep were left, and the population started growing again. Plus, while their numbers were going down, the vegetation got a chance to bounce back, so there was more food. Of course, the sheep got lucky there weren't any real predators on the island, otherwise they wouldn't have had time to evolve at all. But everything turned out well, and the sheep roamed free for 40 years, adapting to their harsh surroundings. They managed to live without human help, even though at first they totally depended on it. And when people came back to the island in 1975 to gather the sheep they'd left behind, they were in for a surprise. The animals looked like regular sheep, but in fact, they were already something else entirely. Like other feral populations, these sheep had evolved into a separate genetic breed. Their legs were longer, and they held their heads higher than their mainland relatives. The wool on their backs was usually pretty weathered. Also, their jaws had gotten deformed from constantly tearing at tough vegetation. So when people tried feeding the sheep regular food by just laying down the grass, they had no clue what to do. The sheep kept trying to yank the grass out of the feeder, and it ended up flying everywhere. In the end, they had to tie the grass into bunches so the sheep could pull it out and eat the way they were used to. There were other distinctive features too, like giving birth standing up and lambs being able to walk just minutes after they're born. They've also developed resistance to hoof rot and a tendency to shed like their wild ancestors. And overall, their coat has changed. Without going into detail, you could just say the sheep have gotten less woolly. Their behavior changed too. As an example, those sheep would graze for ages, from around 4 in the morning to 11 at night, no matter the weather. Remember I told you it gets super windy on the island? Well, the sheep would just turn their backs to the wind and keep eating. It felt like they had to constantly fuel up just to stay alive. And since they did stay alive, well, it worked. But what happened next? Back in 1937, the island was set aside to protect its plants and animals. Then, in 1954, the government declared it a wildlife reserve. At the same time, a court order was issued demanding the removal of the sheep. Failing to comply meant the island would be seized by the state. And that's pretty much what happened. In 1958, scientists carried out a study, counted the sheep, and came up with a number just under 1,000. However, later on, the number of animals recovered. In 1970, a fence was built across the island, and all 1,300 sheep on the northern side were shot. To the south of the fence, there were about the same number, but a later expedition discovered around 2,500 sheep on the southern side, and the population kept growing. When the final culling took place, around 3,000 sheep were shot. In the end, by the late 1980s, the last sheep were destroyed. It was done with regret. Although people liked them, the number of sheep kept increasing, and they were damaging the island's nature. culling was the only way out. Not all the sheep died. A rescue expedition in 1975 and 1976 took 10 live sheep for breeding in captivity in New Zealand. Of course, these sheep had to be gathered first. If they'd been ordinary, people would have used dogs, but these sheep had gone wild, so 10 scientists acted on their own, and they were armed with whistles. Of course, it wasn't easy, and some of the sheep even tried to attack the scientists, but they still managed to gather 58 individuals in the pen. These were impressive-looking rams, plain sheep, and magnificent lambs. It seemed like the sheep were feeding their lambs very well, but it came at a high cost to them. Out of 58 sheep, the 10 healthiest ones were specially selected for the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries. They were tied to the fence with dog collars, but it quickly became clear that it wasn't such a great idea. As soon as people turned their backs, the skewers swept in, and some even sat on the sheep and were ready to start their feast. They had to put in extra effort to chase the predatory birds away, and then they literally had to carry the sheep, one by one, over the ridge about 1.2 miles down to the ship. Imagine someone helps you lift a pretty heavy load onto your shoulders, and then you walk forward, walking with an increasing desire to drop the load for a while, but you can't do it, despite the fatigue and the wind, because you won't be able to lift the sheep by yourself anymore. In the end, the group of sheep left the island just before Christmas. The descendants of these saved animals were kept as a purebred herd for a long time after, and then something very strange happened. In 2017, 5 rare sheep from this unique subantarctic island population were stolen and killed. As a result, the population of Campbell Island's breed dropped to just 30 individuals. Naturally, their owner was deeply upset, as these sheep are incredibly valuable because of their unique genetics. The worst part is that some of the sheep that were killed were pregnant. They were supposed to give birth just 2 weeks after they went missing. At the same time, the criminals had to put in quite a bit of effort to kill the sheep, as there was no direct way to bring vehicles to the place. But why? The owner himself believes that the murder was committed to get some meat for the table. The thing is, based on all the evidence, these wild sheep essentially are probably not tasty at all, not to mention that the meat is simply not safe to eat. As for the remaining sheep, they will of course continue to live and reproduce, preserving their unique breed. But if they'd stayed on the island instead of being kept in captivity, they might have eventually formed a whole new species. And history even knows an example of such a case. About 10,000 years ago, the rising sea level separated a piece of land from continental Australia, creating an island. The native tribes of the mainland knew it as Karta, or Island of the Dead. Obviously, there weren't any dead there, but the island ended up trapping animals, including a small population of kangaroos. The sea protected the island from most of the hunting, land clearing, and invasive species that came with human settlement in Australia. And when the first European explorers arrived at the turn of the 19th century, they saw kangaroos on the island and named it Kangaroo Island. Makes sense. The kangaroos of Kangaroo Island are the only species of kangaroo found on this land, and this type evolved differently from the mainland kangaroos. Technically, they're a subspecies of the western gray kangaroo, but they're noticeably different from their mainland relatives. Island kangaroos are shorter, stockier, and have much darker chocolate brown fur. Otherwise, they're herbivores, feeding on grass and local shrubs, but they've adapted to consuming very little water. Life for these kangaroos is much easier than for those on the mainland. Their relatives there face the risk of dog attacks and road accidents, but on Kangaroo Island there are no large predators. However, the vegetation is rich, so they're not at risk of food shortages. Winters are colder there, though, but to deal with that, the kangaroos on the island have grown thicker fur. In 1925, Frederick Wood Jones, a British naturalist, anatomist, and anthropologist who spent a lot of time in Australia, wrote in his book, Mammals of South Australia, that the kangaroos of Kangaroo Island are the most gentle and the quietest of all its kind. And I'd add that they're also delightfully fluffy. Really, they're like Highland cows, but from the kangaroo world. So if the sheep from Campbell Island were left on their own, they could have ended up, well, bigger, for example, or smaller, because the food would eventually run out, and their wool would gradually change to be lighter, but still better at protecting them from the cold and wind. In short, over a few thousand years, they'd form a separate species. But that's a whole different story. You owe me a like. See you later.